Hello, today we're going to be talking about monopolistic competition and the idea that pubs shutting down are being replaced by coffee shops, small independent coffee shops, and evaluating whether those coffee shops are operating in monopolistic competition act in the benefit of the consumer. Now, to write an essay on this, it's absolutely key that you understand in detail what monopolistic competition is. If you don't, it's difficult to write the essay. And we're going to come back to these ideas, these conditions throughout the essay. A large number of small firms, low barriers to entry and exit, and some product differentiation. And a lot of the application for the essay is actually going to be explaining in what sense do coffee shops exhibit these exact conditions. How do they show that? Give examples of that, and that would be good application as we do it. And then what does that mean, and how does that link to the consumer interest and their benefit? We're going to define the consumer benefit, or the benefit to the consumer, as consumer surplus, as having lower prices or having a higher quality good which yields utility. Right, what I'd like you to do is to think about those two diagrams. How can you get two arguments or for and against that coffee shops act for or against the consumer interest? So pause the video now and think about how you might do that. Right, okay, so our first point, we want to be looking at low prices leading to, or high quality, bit of differentiation of our good. So we know, first of all, that coffee shops are, I think, relatively easy to set up. I haven't set one up before, but I'd imagine they probably are. And this is where we can use our common sense. It's probably be quite obvious that their sunk costs are low. They have to decorate their shops, they have to buy some simple capital equipment, a coffee machine, and they have to train their workers, but again, the training is probably limited and not particularly expensive. Depending on the subsection of the market that we're talking about, in the independent coffee shop subsection of the market, it's likely that advertising and branding costs are also pretty limited. Obviously, that's not true for Costa, your Starbucks, and the big firms, but they are operating in a more of an oligopolistic market, and so aren't really the same feeling for what we're considering in this question. Now, if we look at this, it's really important to have a look at this diagram and think about what exactly we're showing. In this diagram, we are showing the individual independent coffee shop retailer. So this is your local coffee shop down the road, and it's the demand and the revenue and costs for that particular shop. Now, on this, we could make it simpler. So you could, if you wanted to, get rid of those two curves there and just simply show the long run equilibrium as you see there, and it making normal profit. However, if we want to add a little bit of detail, we can then add those two curves back in again, and that makes a little bit more to talk about. So we might say that from our initial position, D1 equals AR1, we've got high demand in the coffee shop sector, and that means that we make a supernormal profit of P1 ABC1. So we get this large area supernormal profit as our tastes change and everyone wants to go and buy coffee. Now, given that that is a profit signal, it signals to other firms to enter the industry, it makes them willing to enter, they have a potential profit to make, then because there's no barriers or low barriers to entry, that means that there can be increased competition. And that comes from the condition of the market. We've said before that the coffee shops have relatively low sunk costs and training costs, for example. And so other coffee shops, they're both willing but also able to enter the industry. Now that shifts the demand curve, or the AR curve, to the left, because as you have, and I think this is the difficult bit to understand. If you're an independent retailer and next to you just opens up another coffee shop, then you will see your customers will be divided between you and the other coffee shop. And so your demand for your shop shifts to the left as you have now more substitutes in the local area. As a result, your MR curve will shift and you could get to a new MC equals MR point here. And as a result, the amount that you sell and the price that you can sell it at false. So now we're at, I should say that's P2, I don't know why that's P1. We should now see a new situation where we have P2 equals C2. They move to the normal profit situation. There will continue to be more firms entering until all those profits are competed away and normal profit is made at P2 equals C2, or where your average costs are equal to your average revenue. Now, as a result, that's a tricky argument to make, but now you have higher consumer surplus due to the lower prices. And also, at the same time, your coffee shop is likely to be fighting for its survival. It's likely to be offering good service, new types of coffee. It's going to have different decoration. It might have Wi-Fi. All of those things are going to be in the consumer's benefit. And if you wanted to as well, you could also highlight that there is a relatively larger amount of consumer surplus here as the price has fallen, and that is good for consumers. Fantastic. We could now talk about whether it's allocatively efficient or not. So clearly we've argued that it's in the consumer interest. Pause the video, think about how you might eval that. Okay, so the clever way, or the best way I suppose we could look to compare is by using perfect competition. And perfect competition will be more allocatively efficient. It will be allocatively efficient because it would produce where MC equals AR, or P equals MC. And at that point, our social surplus will be maximized, and our consumer surplus of XYP1 could actually be larger. We said that consumer surplus was rising because more coffee shops were entering the market and competing away those super normal profits. But if we had a perfectly elastic demand curve, then the output of each coffee shop would be greater, and we would get down to point Z, imagining that our demand curve was actually that perfectly elastic curve as you see there. It would be we would be in a different position there. Right. Therefore, we could argue that it's against the consumer's interest because prices would be lower in perfect competition. But again, we could start to evaluate our argument further by saying, well, would consumers prefer this industry to be in perfect competition? If we think about that, perfect competition has homogeneous products. Every product is exactly the same. Do consumers really want every product to be exactly the same, every shop to be decorated in exactly the same way, no difference in customer service? And so that really does depend, doesn't it? Greggs, perhaps, that they're not in perfect competition, but they certainly do offer a cheap product without much service, without much differentiation, for a much lower price. But many people probably wouldn't go there. They prefer to go to their local independent coffee shop. Right, now, think about the next argument. Economies of scale, that's often the next argument in essays such as this. Think about how you might use this diagram on the right-hand side to consider the benefits and costs of monopolistic competition. Right, coming back, economies of scale, well, we know that the firms in monopolistic competition, the other condition is that they are small relative to the size of the market that we know of, and there's lots of them. Therefore, an independent coffee shop would produce at Q1 with a low output. We can see that low output there at Q1, and therefore their average costs are high at C1. Now, that's because of the lack of economies of scale, and this is your opportunity now to really go into economies of scale and the types of economies of scale that they may not have. So, for example, they're unable to bulk buy their coffee beans. They're unable to take out large loans to start up their coffee shop, so the interest repayments on their loans are likely to be larger than a big company. They're unable to probably have large marketing campaigns because they're having to spread that budget across a relatively small number of cups of coffee that they're selling. Now, if you compare that to Starbucks, they're probably producing at maybe Q2, a lower long-run average cost of C2. And those cost advantages, we could argue, can be passed on to the consumer with lower prices, and that scale also may enable branding, and that might be something that consumers value. You like your branded coffee cup, you like walking around saying you've been to Costa or Starbucks, and also you might like your Frappuccino all the new types of drinks that they are innovating with, your matcha latte or whatever it is, and that might be in the consumer interest, something that a small company may not be able to offer because they don't have the budget to try and innovate. Right, is that convincing? And I'm not sure that it is. To what extent do coffee shops have large potential economies of scale? And is it really the case that our LRAC looks like that, with a very large reduction in average costs as a result of increased scale? Think about that. Why may you argue that that maybe not be true? Okay, coming back, well, potential economies of scale clearly might be small. There aren't any real technical economies of scale to speak of. It's not a large production line. The branding power may or may not be powerful for consumers. We don't know that. I think it probably depends on the section of the market that you're in and the type of consumers that you're targeting. And it may well be that cost and pricing advantages are limited because of the scale of your production. And we also know that Starbucks and Costa, they are really generally no cheaper than independent retailers. And therefore, we could argue that any cost advantages that they do have go to large dividends for shareholders. But I also suspect that perhaps the cost advantages aren't particularly significant, and therefore we are not gaining much in terms of moving this market from the monopolistically competitive type of shop to oligopoly, which is what certainly Starbucks and Costa at the end of the market are. Okay, judgment. What ultimately does this lead us to? Is monopolistic competition good for consumers? Think about what all these arguments turn on, what does it depend on, and what ultimate judgment could we give? So ultimately, it depends on, as in many cases, it depends on consumer preference. There are low barriers to entry at the bottom end of the market, in the monopolistic competitive end of the market at least, and that does mean that the market is reactive. It will react to consumer preference, as we've seen in the question, as it's now taking over from the market for pubs. So the consumer's preference about what they want is likely to be reflected by the type of shops that open up. If consumers suddenly all prefer cheaper priced coffee, then it's likely that the low priced coffee shop which opened round the corner will capture all of the demand, and the other coffee shops will close due to low barriers to exit and low barriers to entry. Likewise, the economies of scale and the size of the minimum efficient scale is really important. And it's likely that that's small in the coffee shop market. Now, I wouldn't do this in your actual exam, but what we're actually saying is that this LRAC curve may well look like that. It may well be a lot smaller than we otherwise see, and therefore the cost advantages are very, very much limited. Finally, we might consider what sub-market of the coffee market we are actually considering. And for some of the consumers within this market, they prefer branded products, and therefore oligopoly may well offer a greater level of consumer service and utility for this type of consumer. I hope that helps to contextualize a little bit more monopolistic competition and use some of those real life sort of common sense knowledge that you could bring in, linking to the conditions of monopolistic competition. Okay, thank you for watching.